Okay, so this is the audio lecture for What is Real. Okay, so in the chapter, Jody O'Brien talks about the intersections between social expression and individual perceptions. So basically, the intersection between how we are expressing ourselves within interactions with each other and between our, individual preferences or tastes and behaviors. So, a huge part of understanding what is reality, how do we understand some sort of theoretical objective reality, is what sociologists or social psychologists call the definition of the situation. So, this just means that, a definition of any situation can differ from moment to moment depending on a person's expectations. So, some actions will really make sense in one context but not in another. And as social creatures, what we do is we often look for the definition of any situation. So let's say we're in a classroom environment, right? What is the mood? Is it somber? Is it joyful? Is it, irreverent? We tend to act or find our own actions to be influenced by the definition of the situation, right? So, how do we know that something is an emergency, right? Well, usually that's because if you think about how people react in an emergency, you can typically read the issue of an emergency by the way that people are acting, right? So how people walk or talk, or, when you think about an emergency, what kind of sounds do you hear, right? You typically, like if you heard an alarm go off, you think of a fire or some other kind of issue. And, that tells you that there's an emergency situation, right? But if the fire alarm goes off and everyone else just acts like it's not happening and just keeps sitting there, chances are so will you. Because to find out the definition of any situation, we're often reading each other, looking to each other to see how the other person reacts. There's a social psychology research study that was done in the 70s that really illustrates this almost comically, how much we will basically sit in a room that's filling up with smoke because we're looking at other people and they're still sitting there. So we figure it's probably fine as long as they're still sitting there. Versus if you're alone and a room starts filling up with smoke, you basically immediately tell someone, hey, because it's an ambiguous threat. So we'll watch that later on in the semester when we talk about bystander effect. But definition of the situation is an important way to understand how we define our own interactions or how we define reality based on those interactions with others. So this is like another part of definition of the situation as what's appropriate where, right? We know that certain activities or behaviors or expressions are more appropriate in certain situations. So where is it appropriate to laugh, right? When you think about all the situations in the society in which laughter is appropriate, it's very different from situations where it's appropriate to cry, right? And how would we know what's appropriate to laugh, what's appropriate to cry? It's typically this definition of the situation. We look to others to see how they act, or if we act, we see how others react to our actions to try and understand what's appropriate, right? So if you're sitting in a comedy, is it appropriate to laugh? For sure. Is it appropriate to cry? Not so much. It's kind of weird, right? If you're sitting at a funeral, is it appropriate to laugh? Probably not, unless the person was awesome and it's some sort of celebration of life kind of thing. But, it is obviously a place that's appropriate to cry. So again, the way that we understand how we are supposed to be or act in any situation, what reality is, right? Whether something's safe, is it an emergency? Is it a somber place? Is it a joyful place? All these kind of things. We figure that out by reading the actions of others. So we're always looking to others in social situations that can define situations for us, right? And we're going to take cues from their actions and their behaviors so that we can understand what's happening. So this is also, definition of the situation is also why prank shows are hilarious, right? Because if you've ever watched a hidden camera prank show, then you know it's hilarious because the people don't know that something's going wrong, that something's amiss. And if you watch these shows with this kind of definition of the situation in mind, or the next time you see one of these kind of things, keep in mind what they do, right? Often they go on acting as normal or act strangely or whatever it might be. But if you really look at them critically, they're looking around to other people to see how they're reacting. And the reason that prank shows work so well and are so funny is because they have people that are actors that are paid to define the situation differently, right? To act as if nothing is amiss. So then that one person comes into the situation and it's kind of like being in a weird reality, right? Where things are off and strange. So when it comes to these understandings of realness, obviously our cultural practices and beliefs are going to include certain rules about what's real and what's not real. And we're going to conform to our culture's reality so we can interact with each other and, live in society, right? So one of the examples they give in this chapter, just to understand how we, especially as social scientists, try to understand the social world through a very rigorous scientific method kind of way, is the way that anthropologists study other cultures, right? So anthropologists are pretty similar to sociologists. Really the difference being that anthropologists are trying to understand values and meanings and interactions and people's cultures that are typically different from their own, versus sociologists were applying some of the same kinds of principles of analysis, evaluation, and really critically looking at values and beliefs and cultures, but of our own culture, right? And this is super difficult to do. So to illustrate this, they gave you an excerpt from the Nasarima article that was published way back in the day. And if you look at the Nasarima culture, it's strange, right? So he talks about the holy mouth men, right? And again, these are just excerpts from the actual reading itself. The Nasarima have an almost pathological fascination with the mouth, the condition of which is believed to have supernatural influence on social relationships. Were it not for the rituals of the mouth, they believe their teeth would fall out, their gums would bleed, their jaws shrink, their friends desert them, and their lovers reject them. Right? They talk about in the Nasarima article how the Nasarima have these holy shrines within their homes where they perform these daily rituals and these mouth rituals, these cleansing rituals, right? And they also talk about the Laptiso and, basically these places that they go to for spiritual healing that can only be done if they are able to basically trade enough of a currency in order to actually seek that kind of help. And when you look at the culture, it's weird, right? Especially this holy mouth situation. But of course, the whole point of the article, even though it's ancient, is trying to apply an anthropological gaze to our own society. So if you notice, Nasarima is just American spelled backwards. And everything in the article, from the obsession with the fonts within the homes and talking about how the value of one's home is often determined by the number of ritual fonts, that's a bathroom, right? Or a medicine cabinet, a sink within a bathroom. So really he just creates terminology to understand what he's seeing within the culture, but of course it's our culture. So yeah, it's weird. We go to dentists. We go to a place where people put drills and all sorts of crazy things in our mouth. We do really believe that if our teeth fall out, people will reject us. Like, these are reflections of our own culture. But when you read them in a cold, detached, anthropological way, they seem super weird and alien to us, right? As bizarre values. So to be a true sociologist, you have to be able to look anthropologically at your own culture. So you have to have a stranger's eyes when examining your culture. And this is a difficult thing to do, but it's essential to being able to have a sociological gaze. You need to basically put aside your preconceived notions and your expectations about what should or should not be from a value system place of how we've been socialized, and really look critically at certain structures just to see what is actually taking place. So it's really, again, difficult to see our culture because our values and meanings, and even our language, is embedded with these values and meanings. It's what we think is normal, from what we wear to what we eat, how we mate, how we organize our groups of people, and really everything, like how we express ourselves, our families, our spirituality, right? The way we see our lives as normal, well, we see others as strange, when in reality, all cultures are super weird. They're only not weird when you've learned the social rules of the culture, and then you understand why people are doing the weird stuff that they're doing. So interaction takes place according to shared cultural rules. So the result of these interactions is a set of meaningful patterns that, we end up thinking of as a society. So there's certain things that we learn through the socialization process, through these interactions. Like the one that always cracks me up is people thinking you need to be quiet in a library. As a person who works in a library at least once a week, it's not quiet at all. There's nothing quiet about it. It's definitely a cultural value system that's going away. But think about how hand gestures are extremely culturally specific, right? A thumbs up in our culture is a good thing. In other cultures, that's very offensive, right? Or the symbol, like the kind of A-OK, where you're making a circle with your forefinger and your thumb, which in our culture means something good, can also mean something very offensive in other cultures. So it's one of those things, like if you were going to travel to another place on business, you learn that not every culture shakes hands, right? Some cultures bow, some cultures just do different things when it comes to greeting someone, when it comes to what hand gestures are appropriate. Like in our culture, we have the middle finger, right, that we use as a way to kind of piss each other off or express our anger when driving. That's specifically me. But that's obviously culturally specific. You can go to many places around the world where if you flip someone off, that means nothing to them, but maybe taking your thumb and, pulling from under your chin up to your chin is considered flipping someone off. Or in places in Europe, turning around what we consider a peace sign to face your hand outward would be considered flipping someone off. So these things are super culturally specific. My favorite of which are the language things, because some of the language ones I feel like are the most illuminating, because language is really just the product of our culture over time and the history of the culture. So I have this coworker at the library. She is a fantastic human person, but her name's Romina. I'll give her credit for this. And she's originally from Sri Lanka before, their civil war. She moved after the Civil War to Britain. So she had a lot of her young adult education in Britain. So as a result, she has a lot of those weird colloquialisms and idioms that have made their way into her language. So my favorite one, and she says so many of these that I always try and write them down right away because they're amazing. But the one that she said to me that always stick in my head was basically like, the phrase like, save your breath, right? Or, that kind of idea of don't lie to me, save your words. The one she said, she was talking about one of her employees calling in sick and just lying to her about calling in sick, about why he was calling in sick. And she was like, save your breath to cool your porridge. And that kind of threw me off because I've never heard save your breath to cool your porridge. I've heard save your breath, but never to cool your porridge. Mostly because we don't even call things porridge here. It's like oatmeal. It's totally foreign to us, but it shows how culture structures language and language structures interaction. So, slight differences like that, even though we're speaking English, right? There's going to be different idioms depending on what culture you're from. So when it comes to reality, this is something that's achieved through symbolic interaction. This is something we'll be talking about throughout the entire semester, right? So we practice social reality every time we interact with other people. Our culture comes from our interactions among individuals who have some sort of shared definitions, like we talked about. And they have situations in which they participate in together that kind of, make them organize themselves around shared principles. So basically, we learn to be human throughout our development, what it is to be human within our specific culture. So symbolic interactionism is a sociological paradigm, one that definitely overlaps with social psychology or has a lot of its roots within social psychology, that does provide tools that can help us understand our shifting definitions and perspectives. So in the chapter, they talk about how society is both stable and in flux, meaning that the paradigm of symbolic interactionism is striving to understand the processes that make some values and understanding stable and others flexible or temporary, right? And so some of the three main points of symbolic interactionism, things we'll be doubling back to throughout the whole semester. The first is symbolic interactionism argues that behavior is assumed to be organized in response to social factors, right? So that we're not just behaving arbitrarily, we're doing it because we're told we're supposed to act a certain way, and also because when we act, people react, and then we change our actions as well. The second point is that the focus of study is on observable behavior and how behavior is based on subjective interpretation of the social environment instead of being a direct response to objective stimuli. Okay, this is slightly more complicated, but basically what they're trying to say through the second point of symbolic interactionism is that we have a subjective interpretation of the environment. So a direct objective stimuli would be like someone punches you in the face and it hurts, right? The reaction, the stimuli being, getting punched, produces the result of ouch, right? But what they're saying is that within the culture mitigates those specific stimuli, right? So that it's not like, okay, if I'm saying something to you as an individual and you react to what I say, I can't read your mind, which is unfortunate because if I could, I just could rule the world, right? If I could read everyone's mind. But I can't. So I read your expression, what you say, how you act as a response to what I've done. So that's what it means that it's a subjective interpretation. Meaning, if you've watched the movie Carrie, they're all going to laugh at you kind of thing. Her mother's subjective interpretation of what adolescence is. Meaning that you don't really know how people feel about you. You think you know. It's your interpretation of how people act. So there is kind of a mitigating factor that's society between a stimuli and a response, right? Versus like, you go to the doctor and they do the test on your kneecap to see what your response time is. That's just a stimuli knocking into your leg, and the response is the jerk reaction of your leg, right? What they're saying is that there's a similar process of stimuli and response, but society is like right in the middle of that. And then the third point of symbolic interactionism is that symbolic interactionism uses interpretive methodologies and basically research, right, to try and interpret the context in which behavior takes place. So instead of just saying, yes, we interact and we mitigate between the stimulus and the response with society, they're taking that a step farther to say to understand how that works, they have to use rigorous social science methods in order to interpret the context in which the behavior takes place. So really to define the situation, right? To understand the language, the cultural value system, all of the things that provide the context in which the behavior is taking place. So again, what is real, right? This is one of those questions we're going to mull over pretty much the whole semester. So truth and reality are really just determined by the context in which they're practiced. So this just means that within each group, there's a take-it-for-granted system of knowledge that establishes boundaries about what's real, what's true, what's right, and these things are very culturally specific. This is why you'll go to a different culture and there's going to be different values about how you live, what you wear, what you eat, right? All of these kind of things. So we consider those things to be true or just good, right? Like one of the ones we'll get into later when we talk about cultural differences in eating is that there's some animals in our society that we factory farm and eat that are like sacred in other cultures or just not eaten in other cultures, right? Like such as cows in India. But in reality, there's a lot of animals that are eaten in other cultures that we don't, like dogs or horses, right? And that's really just because as a society, we've decided, like, no, you don't eat those, right? But that doesn't mean that every society on earth has. So there's animals that we're not okay with eating that plenty of other cultures are, and vice versa, right? And so these things are all just determined by the definition of those specific cultures. And so it's through these interactions with different cultures that we start to actually illuminate and see the patterns within our own culture. Because our society to us is like the air we breathe. We don't see it. We are just in it. So it's often not until you bump into the wall of a boundary that you know that the boundary is there. So in a lot of ways, the kind of culture shock that can come from observing another culture, seeing another way of life, can really be the catalyst to see the way that your life is organized, right? So there are, really symbolic interactionism is trying to understand how groups and cultures produce and reproduce their systems of knowledge as they interact over time, right? So another point they make is that cultural rules about what is real are often contradictory. So contradictory belief systems typically have rules for navigating these contradictions. Like in our society especially, we have a huge contradiction between our values of capitalism and our values of democracy, right? As they're somewhat at odds with each other, because capitalism is a system that favors individual wealth, profit, consumption, really kind of factoring in the needs and prosperity of the individual. It's a very hyper individual system, capitalism, versus, what was ideologically and politically oppositional to it and was somewhat, we'll get into this later, somewhat at play in other countries, though we've never really seen a real version of socialism. Socialism is very different, right? Socialism is very like, at least let me back up. The ideals of socialism, just as the ideals of capitalism. Capitalism is hyper individualistic. Socialism is not individualistic at all, right? It's the idea of a collective. So it's really interesting that we could be a capitalistic society, but also have a democratic political philosophy. And we can get into this all sorts later about how, yeah, technically there are some issues of oligarchicalness and conflicts between capitalism and democracy when it comes to whether or not our government is bought and paid for by rich people. But anywho, the idea about the actual principles of democracy, right, our value system within the society, is that people should have rights to vote. People should have a say in how they're governed and how they're controlled, that there's kind of a collective understanding within democracy, right? While there is a point about democracy having freedoms for people, it's not just about individual freedoms in a very libertarian way. It's a system of, alleviating burdens and oppression for all. Democracy is not just about one group or another, it's about everybody, right? So it's interesting that we live in a culture that has such contradictions between capitalism and democracy, though they are our two biggest values in society. So there are a lot of rules for how to navigate those contradictions, right? And a lot of it has to do with politics. A lot of it has to do with our economic philosophies, like the whole invisible hand and all these kind of things, which is an interesting enough philosophy, right? Or the arguments of supply and demand are an interesting enough philosophical exchange about capitalism. But when it comes down to brass tacks, we bailed out the auto industry. We bailed out the banks. That's not capitalism. Capitalism, on the pure ideological spectrum of that, would be letting the banks fail, right? Because the whole supply and demand situation, the basic tenets would say that if something has lost its value or has now shifted in the culture's definition of it, then it will be replaced by another non-outmoded system. So, yeah, stepping in and taking collectivized money to bail out banks, that's socialism, right? So it's interesting, as a society, we pretend that we're pure capitalism and we pretend we're pure democracy. But in reality, we're not, right? We do have some socialist principles at play within our society, such as police, right? Where does their pay come from? Taxes, right? We have libraries, we have schools, we have parks, we have all sorts of things that are pretty awesome when you think about it, like firefighters, right? I'm stoked about that. I like the idea that I pay a couple bucks, and if my house lights on fire, someone will help me, right? Versus in the real idealistic, like libertarian version of capitalism, it would be like, well, oh, you didn't store a bunch of water yourself or pay for your own private fire department? Well, then your house burns down, right? So within these kind of very contrasting value systems, capitalism and democracy, we find ourselves in it. And there's a lot of ideologies that back these things up. Another big one in our culture is religiosity versus separation of church and state. So we have this very principle that America was built on, this whole ideology of not oppressing people because of their religion, right? Because of a lot of the issues of some of the religious minorities that came here in the early colonizing era, where they were escaping religious persecution. So it was kind of important to them to have a value system where they wouldn't be persecuted because of their religion. But at the same time, we are an extremely religious nation. We're an extremely Christian nation. And as a result, some people within this nation think that we should reify God into all sorts of institutions and things, right? That there's always these controversial fights over God and the Pledge of Allegiance, or having like having biblical references within courthouses or things of that nature. And there is a point that there is a cultural value of separation of church and state, because the founders that put that into our laws were coming from places where the church and the state were one. And so the what was being promoted from the pulpit was the same as what was being promoted from the government. And that can be a very dangerous situation, right? Especially if you are not one of the favored groups that has power and dominance. So it was very important that we have a separation of church and state, and that people can practice whatever religion they believe in, right? But at the same time, we have this weird hyper religiosity. We consider ourselves if you've ever heard a speech by the president, any president, then you've heard them say, "God bless America." Or I guess in the Trump thing, when he was losing his teeth a little bit, that "in our church," right? That was a hilarious clip. But anyway, we also see "in God we trust" in bills, coins, right? Kind of minted onto those things. In the Pledge of Allegiance, we have that "under God," line in the Pledge of Allegiance. Fun fact about that, actually, because again, when these things become controversial and they become lawsuits and people say, my child shouldn't have to say "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance because I'm a secular humanist or whatever, right? And you've had a couple of people have these lawsuits, which haven't necessarily been completely successful, but the idea is that what we often don't know about the Pledge of Allegiance is that line "under God" was not part of it originally. "Under God" was actually added during the Cold War to differentiate us from the Soviets, who were not super fans of organized religion. So it is kind of interesting when you think about how something that has now become so normalized or so central to our American value system of like "under God" or, "in God we trust" and these things were largely a reflection of our fear of other political systems like communism. It kind of helps us understand how that came to be, right? How do we have these contradictions? How do we navigate those contradictions, right? So the tenacity of cultural rules are just how they're able to shape our individual lives and how they can create and recreate differences among people, right? They can create hierarchies where some people have more power and influence and opportunity than others. So these beliefs that we have about power and authority and morality, they're very real in their consequences, meaning that, most of us that have privilege are the ones who are the least aware of our privilege, right? Is this idea, especially as Americans, man, we can get into all sorts of ideological what opportunities people have within our society, and which people are oppressed, and which groups have less rights or opportunities. But then when we compare ourselves to nations that have not been able to be developed, right, have often been under the thumb of colonialism, we see that just having access to clean water is like a huge, awesome thing, right? That we have a lot of privilege when it comes to like the way that we live, the comfort in which most of us live, right? But at the same time, again, these things have real consequences, that authority and power for who actually has access to those things and who doesn't, or how those things are kept away from the developing world so that we can be rich and powerful. So it's interesting how if we have privilege, we often don't know it because no one tells you, right? It's actually my favorite example of privilege, and I know it's like super satirical and not to be taken seriously, but if you've ever watched SNL, there was this Eddie Murphy, I know back in the day, before all the Dr. Doolittles, turns out he was a comedian. And he did this amazing thing where he pretended to be a white man, right? He goes undercover as a white person. And it was really this kind of critique at the time of white privilege, which is, again, hilarious if you watch it. And the idea was like he goes into a store and he's basically in his white face. And the guy doesn't make him pay for his newspaper. And then he's on the bus. And when everyone that's a person of color leaves the bus, they bring out like champagne and all this stuff. Like just this idea that there's this like secret great world for white people. But that's not really what privilege means, right? It doesn't mean getting a bunch of free stuff or, everything being like super easy. It just means you don't have as many barriers or problems as other people, right? Like Peggy McIntosh is a very famous unpacking the knapsack of white privilege, right? She talks about the idea of how she came to understand her own white privilege through really critically thinking about how certain things that she experienced were not the experiences of others, right? So the one that, of course, impacts me the most, she talks about how if she goes into a store, no one's going to follow her. If she tries to get a job and she doesn't get it, she's not going to wonder if it's because of race, right? That there's all of these privileges, things you don't have to worry about, like your name, right? Like if you're white, typically you're going to have a name that's more accepted in society. If you are a racial minority and your name sounds like what would be a name of a racial minority, that can affect you in getting a job, finding housing, and there's so many research studies that point this out, right? Things that we'll be talking about a little bit more in depth later. So she talks about in the article, the one that stands out to me the most, and this is an article written in like 1988, but it's still very relevant today. She says that, and it's always stuck in my head, is that when she gets a flesh-colored bandage, it matches her skin color. And it was something I hadn't considered when I was a young person and I had first read that article. The idea of flesh-colored. What is flesh-colored, right? But obviously nowadays we're a bit more aware of these issues and they've started to kind of change this. But, when I was young, if you were using a Crayola crayon that said flesh, it was a light skin tone, right? If you were using a flesh-colored bandage, it was light skin tone. So again, this idea of the privilege of just never having to think, of just being the dominant majority, never having to feel excluded or other, something we'll really be unpacking throughout this whole time, that it's really, privileges aren't necessarily things that you just get all this free stuff. It's often just, you don't have to have all this other burden, right? That's usually what that's alluding to. So we're going to discuss a lot of those, with more specific examples as we go throughout the course.